Welcome back to the ninth hour. I'm Michael, and I'm with Melanie today.
Hello.
We're going to be discussing the evaluation of Card of the Day set spoilers. Now, as always, this podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, Card Academy. Please be sure to check them out for all the latest and greatest in Japanese and English. Weiss Schwarz.
We've all been there, waiting patiently for someone to translate the latest and the greatest card of the day between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. All the anticipation builds up to a moment where, upon reading it, can either lead to excitement or disappointment. Some players buy into sets based off of love for a favorite anime series, but others make their purchases off of playability. In reality, majority of players mostly fall in the middle of the spectrum of these two extremes. Either way, the very first card of the day spoiled will sometimes make or break a player's investment into a series. So how do we look at spoiled cards and make a decision about whether a series is going to be very playable or not? Sometimes we may make an investment into a set and then realize upon playing it that the synergy just isn't there. Or the card that we read and thought was super powerful turns out to just be mediocre upon playing. Or sometimes the opposite is true. We see a card we didn't think was great upon spoiling that ends up being amazingly good in practice.
And there are a lot of ways that we can kind of manage our reactions, and there are some ways to react that are better than others, right? This is wrong, and this is more correct. But moving on, we're going to have some criteria for how we're going to evaluate Card of the Day spoilers. And actually, for this podcast, we're going to be putting this kind of rubric to the test. We're going to apply it to some sets that have already been released, and we're going to apply it toward something that hasn't been released yet. Now, of course, once that set is released, this practice will kind of be, I guess, locked in time for us to kind of look back on and see, did this work? How reasonable were we? And so on. So if we're watching this before the set is released, and you'll see it at the end, then we get to all kind of participate either by proxy, or if you want to leave your thoughts in the comments section. And we'll also be looking at this kind of retroactively with some older sets. So let's move on and introduce each of these points.
So the first thing here is read the card and think about it.
We want to see if the card is viable by itself or if it requires other pieces to work. This does not necessarily mean that a card is with the CX combo or not. Sometimes it requires other events or other characters to work. Sometimes it just does everything by itself. Next, we want to see is if it's open or kind of a locked trait for the series. So it's a little bit more relevant in series that actually have more than one type. For instance, Love Live, everything is musical. Everything is music, so it doesn't really matter too much. But for something like Ilya, where you have one half which is gems and the other half which is magic, it actually might matter. Next is we want to look is if it's color locked. So things at level 0 are technically not color locked at all. But beyond that, we need to see as well what color it actually is a part of and how easy it is to use at those levels. This can also mean that it is locked with sometimes combos require cards to be used across colors. Even though in this game we don't have cards that are 2 colors per se, it still might need to be used in conjunction with cards with another color. Next is if we want to see if it's a new ability that has not existed in the game at all. Now, with English Weiss Schwarz, it's a lot easier to do this because there's a lot fewer cards for us to look at. But on the Japanese side of the game, more specifically, we want to stack them up against existing cards that have similar abilities and to check them against one another to see, is it really worthwhile? And lastly, we want to see when it's playable. Sometimes we'll see cards that are playable pretty much at all stages of the games, especially level 0s are fit the criteria of this, and level 1, 2, 3, and so on.
going to add one thing on D too is sometimes you have to be a little wary of new abilities that we see on cards in the Japanese side of the game because, and I'll have an example of this later. Every once in a while, when Bushiroad wants to kind of test the water, so to speak, sometimes they will lower abilities or lower power levels or lower other things in the set to see, if, to keep it from becoming what we would quote unquote call broken. So sometimes when we see a really kind of cool new ability spoiled, sometimes that's also a little bit of a hesitation because you get this little immediate little ding trigger that it might affect the rest of the set and what else you get to see. So.
Right.
So on to number 2. We're going to think about where the card fits in the grand scheme of the series, including existing cards and already spoiled cards from the set. This is sometimes really hard to do because, and it sometimes can be easy. If the set is brand new and doesn't have any other support other than this first booster it's getting, it makes evaluation a lot simpler. But if you're looking at a series that has a long history, like, for example, we're looking forward to Da Capo getting a new set, hopefully sometime before the end of the year in the fall, that series has a lot of boosters. And it has a lot of traits, and you kind of have to have some prerequisite knowledge to know what else that combos with. A recent set that was just spoiled that kind of falls into that category would be Milky Homes. You've got several Milky Homes boosters. You kind of have to think about, where do these cards fit in across the series as a whole?
Right. Next is we want to consider the rarity and also the available card slots. Now, this is not to say that common cards are without power, but the most, iconic effects of a set typically are seen in the double Rs for the set. In some sets, like Kontai, we have double R pluses that it's seen as well. These are the double Rs in particular are very special in that because they are a little bit more rare, they tend to try to showcase a lot more of kind of the spirit of the color that they are within. And so just take a look at that aside from other generic rares, and you'll see that they typically have a much more nuanced effect when compared to, say, other normal rares.
I'd also add in rarity too. Sometimes you want to look at depth in a series, and I have a historic example of this we'll look at a little later, but I actually like to look at what uncommons a set is getting. This is just a me personal thing. I feel like that uncommons most of the time in Weiss tend to be very playable, depending on the set and depending on how much support it has. Most of the time, your more powerful level 0s are uncommon. Sometimes you've got assists or utility cards that are in the uncommon slot. And, of course, finally, you sometimes get a lot of nice events. So I feel like sometimes if you look at uncommons or look at your lower rarity cards and you can kind of consider them in the huge grand scheme of things in a set, sometimes you get a picture of depth that, it gives you more options within the series. And that can be a powerful thing depending on what else is going on in the double R and R slots. Next up, we're going to take a second look at cards that fit the word hyped or overpowered. Look beyond this and think about it if it is actually viable. I really feel this speaks for itself. Sometimes you have to sit on the gut reaction and stop and reflect for a moment.
And this is something that is not necessarily restricted to this game at all. See this happening in every card game where some people will say, OMG, this is OP, holy moly, you're going to kill the game, this is so good. And, historically, the kind of outcry that at least cards have received that I've seen across games is kind of a coin flip. Sometimes we get things where we think, whoa, that really is really good. Maybe I should play with it. Okay, it checks out. It's really good. And other times it's, okay, we thought that this was going to be great. Turns out it's, just a pile of cardboard that we can't use. So, I would say that it's kind of if you try to always just write something off as hyped or OP, that it's kind of a disservice because it doesn't really take into consideration why they might be and eventually why they are truly or why they might not be. So we're going to actually use this, like I said, rubric in practice. And we're going to apply this to a set of cards from a couple of series. And as Melanie was mentioning before, sometimes new effects might be really, really promising on the front. But as we might see from this next slide here, our set that we're going to be starting off with for our first evaluation is Charlotte. And there are quite a few things for us to look at here. The first and foremost card was this concept of very easily accessible anti-burn. And we'll just take this from there. So if you have the rubric pulled up, Melanie, let's get started. And I'll let, why don't you start with our first few cards?
So on our first part here, we're going to read and think about the card. So I'm just going to present a general translation. You reads the following. He's a 0/0 1500 power base, swings for 1 soul, that reads basically on reverse, pay 1, I believe it's discard 1,
yes.
And then you may search for a gifted character, which the majority of this set, almost 90% of it is gifted. So you pretty much can search for anything in your deck to replace him. He goes to memory, and then he has recollection continuing while he's in memory. You and your opponent take no damage from auto effects, and most of the auto effects in the game that deal damage are what we kind of slang term as burn damage. So this card basically, essentially, for all intents and purposes, shuts off this auto damage, but it shuts it off on your turn, for you and for your opponent. One last addition on the bottom there, I forgot about something. It's been a while since I played with this card. You have to be level 2 or lower to send him to memory. So you can always get the on reverse pay 1, ditch 1, search, but otherwise you have to send it to memory, you have to be level 2 or lower.
So let's apply the rubric here. Let's ask ourselves if the card is viable alone or if it requires other pieces to work. And for this one, the answer is pretty simple. It works by itself. So we have what seems to be a promising card, right? Something that's powerful tends to be very efficient in that it doesn't need anything else to work. Let's consider the trait. It can look for anything else that matches the trait, and because it's a searcher. So moving down, is it color locked? No, it's a level 0. It's playable at any stage of the game. And is it a new ability? Yes and no. Anti-burn has been printed before. Most recently, especially for those of us who play English, you might recognize the similar kind of thing as a one-sided ability from Log Horizon. And searchers have been printed since the beginning of the game. But the combination of cards is something that we haven't seen before per se, especially because it comes down so early. So to that end, it's pretty new, quote unquote. And we could say that the kind of accessibility is, in a sense, new, right? So let's move on and consider where the card might fit in the grand scheme of the series. Now, this is going to be more difficult for us to apply here, simply because Charlotte's been out for a while. If we think back to when this card was originally spoiled, there was quite an outburst.
Yeah.
Calling for either restrictions or bans because people, curse words aside, were saying, whoa, what's going on here? This is just way too free.
And part of that is because in Weiss Schwarz, as of this date, when we are releasing this video, there is no way to interact with your opponent's memory. There are just a handful of cards in the game that sometimes can kick things to memory, and there's one card from Hierarchy that's pretty famous for sending your entire board to memory and then rearranging the stage. But outside of that, there's not really much you can do about cards that are stuck in your opponent's memory. And
Right.
that's been a problem with a lot of series sometimes over the years, be it anti-heal, be it pendants, or the events from Symphogear are also coming to mind. So that was part of the outburst on that. Is like, what, you send it to memory and I can't do anything about it? My end game is not there. So, but that was the initial reaction.
Right. And the thing that was also kind of really pushing this argument was the fact that it was a normal rare. It was just a rare. It wasn't a double rare. It doesn't have any other. Um, it doesn't have an especially, I guess, iconic ability just because it was so different. And perhaps, thank goodness, it wasn't a double R because such an effect might have just driven up the price of the card. Um, to unreasonable heights. But let's try to look at this as if it was a new card, right? Because this definitely was a hyped card. And the thing about something that prevents things is that it's kind of a different kind of power, right? When Kankale Kantai was first released, it was seen as a really oppressive set because suddenly people were not able to salvage things mid-combat or heal at any stage of the game without being taxed for it, up the deck. So we have to kind of apply a backwards thinking with it because what's a really overpowered effect look like when it's super offensive versus what does an interesting effect look like when it's on the defensive? Because certainly anti-burn is a defensive ability, and the only power that you get is as good as what your opponent is trying to do. For instance, if they're playing something like Madoka, which generally does not have very many burn effects, Charlotte might, or this particular card, right, might look really silly. Or if something is trying to just soul rush and it doesn't really care about using fancy effects to finish the game. But let's say that you have something like, I don't know, TLR or Puyo Puyo, where the end game has historically been just, burn the living daylights out of your opponent with a lot of effects. Suddenly, those decks look substantially worse in the face of this effect. So it's really kind of a scaling power, right? Something that's like weak against the weaker, but stronger against the strong. And that can really make for a difficult evaluation. But let's move on now, because we've talked a lot about what this effect might be, because the whole idea of the exercise was to see if we can apply it to more cards. So let's look at this now. That's next, right?
Well, I'm going to kind of go through this from I'm going to address this from this perspective. So when this 0-0 was spoiled, at the time, the only level 3s that had been spoiled was this 3-2 now. She was the one up in the upper left-hand corner here. She was spoiled, one of the first double R card of the days to be spoiled. So right off the bat, we knew that there was a Musashi effect. For those of you who don't know what that is, when this card's damage dealt is canceled, you may reveal the top card of your deck and put it in a waiting room, and then deal 1 plus the level of that card. Climaxes count as 0 for this effect. Her second ability, her second ability is she gets 1,000 power for having I believe it's 2 or more other gifted characters on the stage. That was the only level 3 that had been revealed double R previous to this R being spoiled. And then on around the same day of that week, the 3-2 which is the third card over here, who could come out if your opponent had an early play level 3, or by shenanigans that the set has a memory kick ability. And he also has a way that he kind of steals power based off of cards on you or your opponent's board. So those are the only level 3s that have been spoiled. So at the time, it was part of the reaction was based off of the fact that at that point in time, we had only seen 2 of the possible level 3s in the set. And so people were like, well, what if they get this with, clock kick, for example, on reverse send a clock, or some kind of other heel looping ability? Well, then this effect becomes a little bit more powerful. It doesn't matter that it shuts off burn for you.
Right, and I totally forgot about that. That was my error, that I forgot that those cards had been revealed in that time. So apologies to the listeners, because I totally managed to derail things away from where they wanted to be. So, Melanie, take us through the next card, if you would. Where do we go from?
So after, so it was really interesting. I was discussing this with a friend because I had actually pre-ordered Charlotte before cards have been spoiled, because I love Key. I have some obsessions with certain anime studios, so I kind of file closer to that. I love the anime, I'm eating the set, whatever spectrum. But, okay, so as the set continued to be spoiled, I became more and more concerned about this cards effect, because the next up spoilers were the twins, Yusa and Misa. I was really disappointed to read Misa's climax combo, because it again didn't synergize with this U. Her climax combo is that you can pay 3, discard a card from hand, and if you have the 1k1 gate out, on attack, burn for 5. And then she has a just even exchange change into her twin, which, this card also heals on play, I'm sorry. But her twin has the change back into her. You can't loop it. You can only do it once before during the change phase, right before the climax phase, at start of climax phase. But this one is a wall. It gets plus 500 for each other gifted character on the board, and then has somewhat of an anti-damage stall effect. Her card reads that when damage dealt to you is not canceled, meaning that it resolves in your damage zone, then you may scry the top card of your deck, leave it on top, or toss it in the waiting room, hopefully getting you closer to cancels, or maybe knowing that you have a cancel coming up next. So this Misa can also be changed into, but with this 2/1 level assist Yusa, it's got a very typical climax based change where it's pay 2, ditch a card, put this in waiting room, change into the 3/2. So we kind of had a sort of relatable heal loop slightly, but it's very delayed because you can only change once. Some people have really capitalized on this, but it can sometimes be difficult to pull off because you have to defend. Hopefully, you play the Misa heal, and then you change into the more defensive Yusa. Hopefully you got a counter, which the set has some decent counters, but they can be challenging. And then hopefully you can relight the loop next turn by changing back into this and healing. But the finish ability, we don't have any here. And then lastly, these 2 cards were spoiled. The 3/2 early drop Ayumi is a very, very just kind of, I don't want to say vanilla, it's a very solid card. It drops early if you have 2 or fewer climaxes in waiting room, heals on play, gets 1,000 power if you have, I think it's 3, either 2 or 3, I apologize if I'm wrong, other gifted characters on the board. Great, this is a decent support for this card. It comes out at level 2, begins kind of the stall game. The biggest card that was which it still helps out this build, is the 3/2 now. She is on attack, reveal top. If it's a gifted character, add it to hand. And then at the start of your opponent's attack phase, you can discard the pants trigger, the climax comeback trigger, climax from hand, and declare that the character across from this, facing this, cannot front attack. So it can kind of force your opponent to have to side, and unless they've got a +2 soul or a 3 soul base, level 3, it kind of basically sort of delays an attack, hopefully. And when you ditch the climax, you get the chance to compress your deck because you also get to search for a gifted character. So upon spoiling, it seemed like that this deck had some stall tactics, but there wasn't really a big claw kick. At the very end, right before the set release, they spoiled this 2/2 uncommon U, 7,500 power base, swings for 2 soul, plus 500 on the stage for each other gifted character, combos with a 2k1, that this is kind of common for level 2s that clock kick on reverse, but you have to pay 1 on attack, and then if it reverses its battle opponent, if it's a level 2 or higher, you can send it to clock. Now, I don't have the card pictured here, but there is a 0/0 global now assist that it has the ability to choose a character, either yours or an opponent's, and give it +1 level for the turn. So essentially this clock kick is not a bad thing, but because you have to pay for the cost before your battle opponent actually becomes reversed, people can counter and get around its clock kick, and then you're out of stock. So that could be used for other things. So that's kind of what we were looking at going into, but a lot of people felt like, oh, this ability is just so great. This is really powerful right now with Tulavru and Nisekoi and other sets sort of dominating, that at the time, this looked like it was going to be really powerful.
Now, as we can see from results, it's only really found rare amounts of success. Like it has been in the past, but its successes were and have been historically far and few between. I know that the first time I ran this in a tournament, I did okay, and then not so great with it. My build was not that good to begin with, but there were not a lot of times where it felt like the effects that I was using were really unfair per se. Now, I know I have a friend who has built a twins build where it just kind of uses the heal and the damage prevention loops and uses the anti-burn as an option in the deck, which I think is very interesting. We've actually featured them on the site before. And there's also the more well-known blue-yellow and also blue-green combinations. Red has not really seen a whole lot of play, but we can learn from looking back at the reactions to these cards that the performance did not necessarily live up to the hype. So let's move on from here and go on to our second set.
So many of us, I don't think, will ever forget the reaction when this card on the left, this 3/2 Marika from Nisekoi, was spoiled. I believe it's probably been one of the biggest. I mean, we've got a lot of examples we could throw up here, but this probably takes the cake. And a lot of it has to do with the time that it was released, but it's still a pretty powerful card even today. So, let's go through the list, Michael.
Oh, boy. Because for those of us who have played with this card, now, those of us who play English may not recognize this Marika, because on the Japanese side of the game, this Marika has an insane pair of abilities, wherein the second ability is if she reverses her opponent in battle, you can pay, I believe it is 3, or is it pay 2? No, it's pay 2 to discard 3 cards and then restand her.
You also have to have 2 other Kia characters on the field. Not a big deal in this series, but worthy of mentioning.
And on attack, if you have at least 2 pendants in memory, she burns for 1 on attack. So you can attack for a full level's worth of damage broken up over time with just 1 card. And also for English players, this card on release was playable as a 4 of. It was terrifying. So we'll look at this rubric, and we will kind of uneasily apply it to this, because again, for those of us who have played the Japanese side of the game, this feels so unnecessary because we've probably lost to it or used it and won many times in the past, right?
And I kind of feel like, so when this card was spoiled, it was about, I'd say, at least a third of the way through the spoilers. So at the time that this card was spoiled, a lot of the reaction was based off of one of our other rubric tenets, which was think about like what other cards exist in the series to complement this. At the time, this 1-0 Marika that had the climax combo with the 1K1 gate trigger in this series basically reads that when she reverses her battle opponent, you may salvage a character from waiting room. So we already knew that there was a really great hand plus. At the time, we had also already seen spoiled this 3-2 Kosaki. She gets 1,000 power if there's 2 or more other key characters on the stage. On play, search your deck for a key character, and then her final ability, it was just a little mind-boggling, but she was one of our non-change oriented early condition costs to get out early that was much easier than what was normal for the time. She got -1 level in hand if you had up to 2 pendants of promise in memory. Pair that with a 0-0 global that on play, ditch a card, any card, and salvage one of these 4 very powerful pendants of promise, all of which, even the least played of these events, the green one, all super playable. The 1-1 we had seen spoiled already in the trial deck was just a flat out pay 1, search for key character, send this to memory. The 1-1 blue was a conditional, if you control a key character, it becomes a 3K counter for a key character in battle. This 1-1 green event basically reads you have to have a key character to play it, and then choose a character. It gets 3,500 power till the end of your opponent's turn. And then finally, probably the biggest one was the 1-1 red that was on play, salvage 2, discard a card from hand, send it to memory after you rest 2 characters. Pair that with also a runner, a 0-0 level reverser that had the option to run to the open center slot on your stage of your front row if it was open. Pair that with this uncommon 0 Kosaki that's an on-play, pay 1, discard 1, search for key. That was just an uncommon. By the way, it's worthy of noting, as far as rarity goes, that this effect in some sets is a rare, that it's not just an uncommon. Lastly, probably what took the cake the most and was spoiled pretty much because they kind of spoiled the girls in sort of groupings, was this 1-0, again, uncommon, conditional, if you had a pendant and promise in memory, level 1 or lower reverser, that was also an on-play reveal top. If it's key character, add it to hand, ditch a card from hand filter. Back that up with some nice support level 3s. There's the most competitive version of this deck back in the day was a blue-red, and you just ran the Kosakis and then splashed in a couple of this 3-2 conditional on reverse top deck Chitoge for your heal. Or some people also ran the green 3-2 Kosaki that has your more traditional base change, but her changer was a 2-1 3K vanilla counter. Which is important because, you talk about room and deck for changes and needing room for counters and stuff, and having that kind of ability on a counter was, that was something a little newer that hadn't been seen a lot before. And it was pretty powerful because this Kosaki had a climax combo with the gold bar or treasure trigger that on attack just search for 2 key characters. Lots of ways to plus hand to meet her discard 3. And so the reaction was based off of the fact that people had already seen some of these cards spoiled and knew that there was going to be some viability, that this card, that its cost, the pay 2, ditch 3, was not going to be something that, couldn't be done. And in fact, like Michael said, sometimes people were able, when you were able to run this as a 4-of, were able to restand 2 of these in a turn if they could get over stuff.
Sick.
it was pretty crazy. So, but the reactions were, because of when the card was spoiled, were based off of some of the other cards that had already been released. And so people kind of already got the feel that there was some synergy. Also of note, this set was the first. So, up to the point that these spoilers were happening, all we had was a trial deck that had been released in March of the previous year. So, there was no need to really worry about cards from another set or something that already existed. It was more just kind of locked into itself, and it made it easier for people kind of skimming through the cards that had already been spoiled to make some decisions about its playability.
Right. So let's go back to this Martica and apply the rubric. And as Melanie said, right, it did require a bunch of other pieces to work, but because of what had already been spoiled before, there was already kind of a deck theme in mind for a lot of players by the time the cards had been kind of revealed to us. The card, I mean, the entire setup to that point was kind of a single trait. And given that we had already seen that the most powerful effects were going to be on trait, it was, more or less irrelevant. And also the fact that the card was not especially color locked. Now, eventually, when the bans came down, she kind of did become color locked for a little while until the ban list was updated yet again to prevent people from just running four of her in a deck. But to the extent that running a deck with two or even three colors, I've seen three-color Nisekoi. I even, in fact, have used a three-color deck in this series. It's not terribly outlandish to call it uh, only slightly color locked because there are so many ways to readily access other cards within the deck based on what one is using, and the ability is. Well, we've seen restanders in the past. Those are not new, but pairing them with an on-attack burn trigger, that that kind of brutal combination certainly had not been seen prior, and it was so bad that that it didn't even make it to English in its same form. It barely resembles.
It was a card that was I hate to say this, but every once in a while you do see this in spoilers, in that we have cards that are ahead of their time. Bushiroad was, if you look back at what was going on in 2014, previous to that, Bushiroad had some sets that were like a little bit more heel heavy. That was the bigger mechanic in the game, and it was very much decks mainly looked for ways to stall. And then Bushiroad began introducing cards to the game, like in sets like Kill la Kill and also Kantai Collection, that were more heavy, like finish based, where instead of just having like a finisher that could deal maybe one extra point of damage, we now have finishers that, if they meet their conditions, can finish for a lot more. And Marika was kind of the advent of these new heavy finishers, that they would deal more than one instance of damage on their attacks and through their abilities, and really push for that game to end quickly and not stall out. At the time, they're outside of the Musashi effect, punish burn effect that existed in Kantai, and Little Busters following in that September, and Kill la Kill. There hadn't been a ton of really updated finish heavy pushed characters. A lot of sets were still relying on heals and on clock hicks, and maybe just on play punish burn to finish out the game. And it was ahead of its time. And nowadays, I mean, this card is still powerful, not to be taken lightly, but we now have some other finishers that can kind of toe the line. That they exist. They push for the same kind of damage. Maybe not exactly as much as this card, but we see more instances of this now.
Right. So moving on to the other kind of points, right? Melanie already kind of went over how we as the players and how others too, watching the spoilers, kind of considered the existing cards that we'd already seen, and also looked at the rarities. And for those players who are certainly more experienced, right? One can potentially take a look at some spoilers and kind of make a rough deck sketch in one's head. Now, based on the cards that we have here, as you can see, it did not take very long for the quote best builds from the set to show up and start winning, well, just about near everything. It was for some people who didn't really like it, it was pretty obnoxious, and for those who were reaping the benefits of I don't want to say easy wins, but
a
more
lot of
easy accessible wins.
a lot of sets just didn't have a way to deal with this. There were some sets, like for example, the big sets that were problems for Nisekoi upon release were were basically Kantai was the big matchup that was the problem. And then on the sides, you had Little Busters, and you also had some of the decks that could super wall up at level 3. But those decks hadn't received support in a while. And most notably, I'm thinking of the Milky Homes and DeCapo, the Mecha Banana build. Those were just some of the ones that I remember coming up against as a Nisekoi player, and it's like, well, I'm not going to be able to reverse anything. But at the time, you were still able to play. Her as a 4-of, and so it didn't really even matter because what you did is you just played 3 of her and you dinged them into the walls, and you still got the on-attack burn. So you know, even that didn't really kind of delay the inevitable. Also, I believe at the time, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, the only anti-damage counter in the game that existed was in Little Busters. It was a 2/3. It's fondly referred to as the money counter. That basically was choose a character, and that character doesn't deal any damage for the turn. The on-attack burn happens before that counter can be played, but that basically would shut off the Marika. But there weren't any other sets that had that, so it was pretty crazy.
Yeah. So we've gone through this kind of as a retrospective a walkthrough of how we kind of apply this rubric to the past, but let's make this a little bit more, I guess, relevant right now. Now, before we move on, we have a card that's coming from a set that has only a couple of extra boosters in the past. And so without further ado, we're going to be looking at our last card, a single card here from Ilya. Now, this is going to be interesting because the set or the series is not attached to the greater, I guess, Fate universe because it's kind of its own little offshoot. So you can't play it with I was almost about to say for granddaughter. You can't play it with a lot of the rest of the Fate series. You can only play Ilya with Ilya. And so it's interesting because it's EBs first, followed by a normal BP or booster pack. Normally, sets or series get a booster pack first and then get an EB. Examples of this are Nisekoi, at least for the Japanese side of the game. It hasn't come to English, and we don't know if it will. And Sword Art Online, which actually has had its EBs come out in English, and will be completing the loop here in, I believe, by the end of the month. So, now for those of us who are not as familiar with Ilya, the first, it was kind of the first, I guess, flashy combo in a world before Marika and all these, really easy to execute burn combos. We had the Kaleidoscope combo, which was this ridiculous, convoluted set of actions that one had to take and hope for in order to secure the effect of on attack burn 1. That was it. Never mind the fact that you could actually do it twice if you were very fortunate, and that it actually took multiple copies of a certain climax being in hand. It's okay, Johnny will edit that out.
Yeah. Yay, my fiance's phone.
Anyway, moving on from that. So, Ilya got a second EB, which introduced Kuro as a character and added a lot more, I guess, less flashy options to the Ilya endgame. It also made gems just slightly more viable because before when we only had one EV. The Gems deck was more of a very it was more of a fun deck. It was not very powerful at all. But with a full booster pack that is about to be released, both sides, both the Magical Girls and the how to put it, the very salty girls who used to be Magical Girls who are on the side, right?
Mhm.
Will also be potentially getting some support. So we have already a couple of kind of frameworks in mind for what decks might look like, but we also don't know what the end game might look like as well, because with any set they're going to inevitably print level 3 characters, and lo and behold we have one right in front of us. And so this Ilya, if I'm reading this correctly, when played from hand, heals and has a climax combo that when it attacks with 2 markers under it, and if those markers are of the appropriate names, I believe she uses both Ruby and Sapphire.
Yes.
That goes within the flavor of it. She gets 2 abilities until end of turn. When she reverses her opponent in battle, you can deal 5, and you can also deal 2. And those are, because you're the turn player, go in any order that you choose. So, you can burn 5 first, and then you can burn 2, or you can burn 2 and burn 5. That is the card that we have in front of us right now. So if we look at its viability alone, we can say that this is not something that we would want to use on its own. We clearly would need to run, I believe it's since been spoiled that those are level 0s.
The first level 0 Sapphire is the probably much needed global support for this magic characters in the series. Just a sec, Michael.
Mm-hmm. No problem. This is why we have Johnny.
I'm afraid. Okay.
Okay, now then.
So the 2 supporting cards that become markers are Sapphire is a continuous, all of your magic characters get plus 500 global, which for those of you who are familiar with the series know that sometimes getting back row characters to help out was a challenge. Probably the most powerful one was a difficult to get promo. And then its second ability is to choose 1 Kaleidostick Magical Ruby from your waiting room and place it face down as a marker under Y-Form Ilya, which is the rough translation for the name of the 3/2. If you control 1 with no markers underneath it, and then you can choose 1's Y-Form Ilya you control and put it under it as a marker. The Ruby Kaleidostick is when it's played from hand to the stage, reveal the top card of your deck. If it's a magic character, add it to your hand, then ditch a card from your hand to the waiting room. Otherwise, it goes back to its original place. And then when it's played from hand to the stage, choose a character, and it gets 1,000 power until end of turn. So 2 decently nice kind of just, they're both in blue, which is Ilya's color. Both of these are rares, and they are level 0s, so they could even be splashed into a dual color deck to go with it.
Now, the thing about this is that now we kind of have the knowledge of what these supports are right now, because when this Ilya was first spoiled, we didn't know what the supports looked like. Now that we know what they look like, it changes the viability yet again. But if we look at what it was like before, right? If we just narrow it down to this one effect, it kind of looks a little clunky because we don't know how the other 2 cards are going to interact. And on top of it, it's a climax combo, which means, especially at level 3, you're probably going to want at least 4 of whatever climax it is just to make sure that you get it by the end of the game, so that you don't have to save it in earlier turns and whatnot.
Also, what's scary is this card is, when it attacks, it wipes all of your stock, and Ilya can be a very stock-heavy set to play, and so if you wipe all of your stock, yeah, you're going to generate a little bit more from your attacks, but if you keep wiping it for multiple copies of this, that could be scary.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult. It would definitely be difficult to say encore even one of them if you were to attack with three. Now, of course, if you're attacking with a full board of these, uh, your opponent's going to have certainly more, more trouble than you are with a little stock. It's like, well, what good is stock if you're already dead, right? But it is something to consider. Now, to compare that with something like Akangi from Kankale, we can also kind of surmise that having your stock completely wiped out is not that bad of bad of a thing, or not that big of a deal, because I mean that deck has done just fine on both sides of the game, um, at least Kankale builds that run Akangi, and so this is Vi form Ilya looks kind of similar in that regard. The only difference is instead of drawing cards, she heals, and it's kind of it seems like an ability that's kind of tacked on there, but it kind of condenses two really important effects in one card because if we look at other sets such as TLR and Puyo Puyo, and I know that I keep on harping on those too, but it really does come through that those sets with their very powerful burn abilities, and even the previous iteration of Ilya, a lot of burn abilities don't get typically put on cards that have heal abilities. And this Ilya certainly looks a lot more promising because, some decks that run all these burn combos might have to just run some poor healers just because they might need to have that extra reach. Like, what if you get to 3/6, you need to attack 3 times, and you'll have 2 cards left in your deck? Well, you're up the creek. But with something that at least heals you and guarantees you the ability to attack through a refresh, I mean, hey, that's pretty good. So for those with prior knowledge too, you'll know that Ilya is blue. There is absolutely no other color other than blue and red in the series. And based on what we've seen revealed so far, it looks like it's just going to be blue and red only. But this could, of course, change because this is one of very few cards that has been spoiled so far. If we look at the rarity, we see that it's double R. So we don't know what other kinds of effects we might see from this, but it looks like this is what Bushiroad wanted to be kind of the flagship blue effect, which is kind of rare, right? Yes, you sacrifice all your stock, but you get to heal and you get to burn. So,
Now,
as optimistic, I don't know.
can I ask, because I don't know the series as well as you do, Michael, what other level 3s in the previous extra boosters would kind of complement this and wouldn't, because this is a climax combo, I kind of asked myself when I read it at first, I was wondering, are there other level 3s that are not climax combo tied that could work with this 3-2? Because what I've seen from Ilya builds at my locals, I've seen either Kaleidoscope, or I've seen some of the Miyu build where she comes out early with the climax combo and shuts off events and backups. So you kind of get locked in because it's a climax combo. Are there other level 3s that complement this?
Not really. Like I was saying before, the Kaleidoscope combo is it's almost exclusive to its own. It's almost exclusive to its own deck because the end game basically uses 12 slots in a deck. You can shave it down to 11, or I've seen some even go with 10. But the premise is you have to run 4 of the climax for sure, and you definitely want to run as many of the level 3 Kaleidoscope, Miyu, and Ilya as possible. So to that end, this Ilya looks like she wants to just take over the end game entirely. I mean, it's a little bit thematic because it's her second form, or Zwei form, and it does require a climax combo at level 3. So I think this is what it looks like to me, is that Bushiroad wants to push a different endgame for the series, or kind of update the Kaleidoscope combo. Because if you remember the Kaleidoscope combo, it involves kind of milling a card at the top, and it needs to be level 1 or lower. And in order to discard the climax, you have to fulfill that condition, and only then, after you've milled the right level of character and then discarded the copy of the climax, can you impart the ability to give everything on attack burn 1. So This one is not nearly as constrained or convoluted. I think they're trying to cut down on a bit of the complexity, and it's kind of it looks good. At least I'm hopeful about it. As somebody who's, as I was trying to say before, a little optimistic about cards. I don't really know right now where it's going to be, but I have high hopes for where it's going to go, and certainly there might be another level 3 that actually triggers off of the same climax being used. We don't know if the same climax is going to be used at level 1 as well, which is a kind of a popular overlap to have with some of the sets, in that they are used at both levels 1 and 3, for instance. But looking at it, I guess more cynically, we can say that it's really difficult to get this to overpower something, because we don't necessarily know what kind of power support the set might get, because it's kind of it's a little understat, right? Being 9,500 at 3.2. Typically we see a 3.2 at 10,000 power, but it's just at 500 less, probably because of the rare combination of heal and burn, and because they want it to be a little bit more challenging to reap the reward of that double burn.
Also, what's scary is, like, you actually put cards from your stage underneath it as markers, and while that can be a plus as far as compression is concerned, you're also going to end up getting rid of your global 500 assist, because that's the ability on it, is to put it itself and the other Kaleido stick underneath it as markers. So let's say after you attack the turn with this, what's going to end up happening is next turn, if you need to ping for damage, I don't know what your hand looks like at that point. I know Ilya can build hand, but at the same time, it ends up going ahead and, like, you don't have anything left on your stage to ping with, or even to move forward.
Right. So we've taken a look at this card, and we've seen kind of the context about it. And as we said before, this whole discussion here will get kind of, dated as we see the rest of the set being spoiled, and eventually when the set in its entirety is released. But until then, we hope that this has kind of been a good framework for us to all work with, to see how we like cards, when they're originally spoiled, and to, kind of avoid memeing to no end. If you have your own opinions of that, we'd be glad to hear from you. Please be sure to leave comments to see if there are any things that you think we might add to this rubric, or even just about the cards in general. And we will see you all next time. Thanks again to Melanie and to Card Academy.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. Thanks for listening.